Welcome to my new YouTube channel. My name is Chris Roop, and today I'm excited to share with you a presentation that I just gave at the Midwest Creation Fellowship in Illinois. What I shared on was the topic of paleoanthropology, the study of these so-called ape-human ancestors called hominins, and I focused on Lucy, the famous partial skeleton that is presented in textbooks and museums all around the world as a persuasive missing link or transitional form. I addressed not only the partial skeleton, but the species that she's believed to belong to, called Australopithecus afarensis. And there are several human bones that have been mistakenly classified as Lucy species, which is really big news because that falsifies the Ape-to-Man story. You can't have true human bones predating the origin of the genus Homo, the human genus. That's impossible. So, and then I focus on Lucy's skeleton in particular. Lucy's skeleton, in my view, and I demonstrate this showing photos and going through the anatomy and really key diagnostic features, that Lucy is actually a small-bodied human, a pygmy. I believe there is evidence for a pygmy population living in the Hadar region of Ethiopia in the past. So I call this the pygmy human hypothesis. And again, these findings falsify the Ape-to-Man model. You can't have true Homo sapiens. Humans cannot predate our own origin. That would be impossible again. So I hope you'll watch this, hope you'll be encouraged by it, and stay tuned. I'm going to be presenting a lot more evidence in support of the biblical view of creation in the upcoming, from here on out. So subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends, and stay tuned. Thanks so much for joining me today.
So this talk will be on paleoanthropology. It's a mouthful. We'll define the term in a moment. And the subtitle, though, is Falsifying the Evolutionary Ape-to-Man Story. So paleoanthropology. It is a branch of paleontology that involves the study of ancient human fossils, supposedly ancient human fossils, stone tools, artifacts, and now even DNA. We can extract DNA from fossils like Neanderthals and sequence their genomes and learn about them. And what we find is that they are far more human than they ever imagined. They're one of us, Homo sapiens, but they've been dehumanized due to evolutionary preconceptions. So that's the field we're focusing on. And maybe you guys have heard of Lucy. Raise your hand. Probably everybody has heard of Lucy, the famous partial skeleton in museums and textbooks. Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, all these different species names. And we want to sort through some of those today. So the evolutionary literature, they use a technical term to describe these so-called creatures, and they use the term hominins. And I'll define that in a moment. So when we look at the evolutionary tree, not the biblical narrative, of course, but from the evolutionary perspective, here's how they think of these creatures. So here's a primate phylogeny is what it's called, or evolutionary history of how we're supposedly related to primates. You'll notice on one end you'll see a lemur with a long tail, and on the other end you'll see Homo. The word Homo means it's our genus, the human genus Homo. We're Homo sapiens, right? And right next to Homo, you have Pan. What is Pan? That's chimpanzee. And they have a number there, 6. And so they believe that modern living chimpanzees and humans share a common ancestor that lived supposedly around 6 million years ago. Okay, and we're going to zoom in on this little circled part right now. So zooming in, you see chimpanzees, they live today, and Homo sapiens. So when we say hominins, I'm referring to all species considered directly ancestral to humans or very closely related. And they're all the descendants after the hypothetical last common ancestor between chimps and man. That would be called, and they haven't found the bones of that creature, they haven't found the fossils, but they envision it to be something like a chimp-like creature, something that resembled a chimp. They debate that though. And so when I focus on hominins, I'm specifically referring to not any of the fossils that might be between the chimp-like ancestor and chimpanzees, but all of the so-called species between the chimp-like ancestor and us. Does that make sense? So that would include fossils like Lucy. And the technical name is, or the species name is Australopithecus afarensis. We're going to spend a lot of time on that right there. Okay, so let's move forward from this. So where are hominid fossils found? Well, evolutionists believe they find these all over the world, in Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, Indonesia, we'll mention one finding there. But today I'm going to focus on just East Africa, because that's where evolutionary paleoanthropologists believe the origin of the human genus evolved. That's where we first arose, according to their theory. And we'll focus on Hadar, Ethiopia, where the discoverer of Lucy did some work in the 1970s as part of the International Afar Research Expedition. His name was Donald Johansen. And then south of that, in the Kubifora Formation in Kenya, Richard Leakey, another famous paleoanthropologist, was finding fossils in the 70s around the same time. And his mother was working even further south in Laetoli, Tanzania, and she found a number of discoveries. And this was also at the same time, around the 70s. So that's where we're going to focus on, this history in the 70s and how it gave us our modern understanding of evolution, human evolution. Now I'm going to go through a definition now that is really important. And that has to do with something known as falsifiability. This is a key principle of science. Raise your hand if you've heard of this concept of falsifiability. So in order for something to be considered a scientific theory or a testable hypothesis, it has to have the potential of being falsified or refuted. If it doesn't have that criteria, it's not science. So falsifiability is theories must have a definable criteria by which they can be empirically tested. So they have to have the potential of refutability. Now, J.B.S. Haldane was a famous evolutionary scientist, and he's most recognized for contributing to early thoughts on mutations and also Mendelian genetics, and he helped to give rise to the modern theory of evolution. It was called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. Okay, but he once was rumored to have said a quote. We don't know if he actually said it. I think he probably did, but it's interesting. And he's trying to explain what it would take for him to reject evolution, which he was deeply committed to. He says, if I found a fossil rabbit in Precambrian rocks, it would be sufficient for me to basically reject my belief in evolution. And Precambrian, do you know the age of Precambrian? It's believed to be older than 540 million years old, back to basically 4.5 billion years. So any time in there, he would say, I would not expect to find rabbits fossilized because that would be before mammals even evolved. And that wouldn't make any sense. Even from a biblical point of view, it wouldn't make sense because all of the Precambrian is not fossil-bearing sediments that were laid down during the flood. But anyway, that was his criteria. And so is there a criteria, though, for falsifying the evolutionary ape-to-man model? In other words, can we use a similar type of analogy to see whether or not we can falsify human evolution? So instead of finding fossilized rabbits, maybe we can find something like Pliocene Homo sapiens. And I'm going to explain why that would be a criteria for falsification in these next few slides. But before I get to that point, I want to lay some groundwork. So to understand this concept of falsifiability for human evolution, we have to understand when the origin of Homo first arose. So according to evolutionists anyway. And that's kind of hard to define because according to evolutionists, they'll make these trees like this. And they used to be pretty simple. But with every new discovery and every new supposed species, it adds more and more branches and twigs, making it a bushier and bushier, basically a bush. Instead of a tree, it's more like a bush, and it's uncontrolled. And so that's why experts in the field, like this very famous evolutionist, Bernard Wood, will admit, even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo, humans, remains what? Elusive. So this looks confusing, but notice all these different skulls are representing different supposed species of hominins. And the branches are all disconnected. You can see that. That's not by accident. This is Bernard Wood's tree. And what he's trying to show is that we can't figure out when humans first arose. We have an idea of when. We don't know what it evolved from, and they're still trying to figure out that fundamental question of evolution. Where did humans come from? And so the general idea, though, is that one of these Australopithecus creatures in yellow evolved into early Homo, shown in blue. That's generally the idea. So they're going from yellow to blue. Australopithecus, some type of ancestor, gave rise to Homo, and they think that happened maybe around 2.5 million years. Here's a quote focusing on that. So this is from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This again is from an evolutionist. He says, the greatly expanded fossil record shows that the Australopithecines, that means Australopithecus, like Lucy's kind is Australopithecus, okay? The Australopithecines comprised multiple species. Lucy's kind is just one of them, and it suggests that our own genus Homo descended from one of these. Why do they say one of these? Why don't they name a specific one? Because they don't know which one. Some might say it's Lucy, some might disagree, but they think it's about 2.5 million years ago. So here's the history. Notice all the question marks. So instead of broken branches that are disconnected, they have question marks all over. They can't define when Homo first evolved and what it evolved from, but they're estimating probably around 2.5 million years ago. And by the way, I don't accept the dates here, okay? I'm just assuming it for the sake of argument to establish this principle of falsifiability that we'll get to. So according to the evolutionary model, when did Homo first arise? You just saw 2.5 million years ago, but in 2015, they found a jawbone with human teeth, and so they attribute it to the genus Homo. And I think accurately. But let's just go back to the 1970s, 1980s. There was a decade-long controversy over an ash tuft called the KBS tuft. And different dating methods were giving different. There was a lot of debates about the correlation of fossils, different dating methods, and when the genus Homo arose. They settled on 1.8 million years. Then in 1977, they found a jawbone, and it was dated to 2.3 million years. And so that means the origin of the genus Homo got pushed back further, even older. And then again, in 2015, the same one I just showed you, it pushed the origin of Homo even further back to around 2.8 million years old. And what do you think is going to happen in the future? I suspect in the future they might find more fossils that date even older that they have to call Homo or human. Now, I want to get to a really important point though. You can't keep pushing the genus Homo back too far. There's reasons why, right? So can the human genus predate itself? In other words, the genus Homo can only be pushed back so far in time. It can't date older than its supposed origin. You can't be born before your parents, right? You can't be born before your ancestors. So this is why evolutionists must classify human-looking bones, true human bones that look just like our bones anatomically. If they date older, according to their methods, if they date older than 3 million years, they have to call those Australopithecus. Why? Because again, you can't be born you can't exist before your ancestors. So if it predates the origin of the genus Homo, even if it looks human, they won't call those bones human. They'll say, well, it must be from its precursor species, Australopithecus. You follow that? This also happens to bolster the evolutionary claim that the Australopithecus type, like Lucy, walked upright like modern humans. And that's why in museums they show Lucy with a very human-looking skeleton from the neck down, human feet, human hands, you name it, but a very ape-like skull. That fits their evolutionary narrative that we evolved the ability to walk upright before big brains. So do you see what they're doing? When they find human bones that they describe as anatomically human, they cannot call it human because that would falsify the theory of evolution if it dates older than the genus Homo. Amazing. But guess what happens if they keep pushing that date back further and further when they find more and more human bones dating earlier? If Homo continues to be pushed back older and older, you are left with a biblical model of complete coexistence of Homo and Australopithecus, their supposed ancestors, with no evolutionary common ancestor. Amazing. So every time we find more of these bones that look human, that date earlier and earlier, we're basically developing what looks to be like a very biblical scenario, even assuming their dates for the sake of argument. All that to say, we now have a very clear criteria for falsification. The discovery of true human fossils dating considerably older than 3 million years would falsify the evolutionary ape-to-man model. According to their own criteria, that would be like finding a Precambrian fossil rabbit or a Pliocene Homo sapien, okay? So how many fossils of Precambrian rabbits would it take to falsify the theory of evolution? 100? 1,000? 500? 1. You only need one out-of-place fossil. I'm going to show you several. There are so many. We can be confident the modern theory of evolution has been falsified, even assuming their own dates and their own descriptions of fossils. And I want to propose a simpler model to you tonight as well, and we'll get to that at the end. But here's a quote from an expert in the field called a paleoanthropologist, Leslie Aiello. She says, "No doubt about it, Australopithecines are like apes, and the Homo group are like humans." Now, she said this a long time ago. This would appear to be very biblical, though, wouldn't it? We have apes, we have humans, and that's pretty much what we observe today. But if you were to ask her more carefully, what exactly do you mean by that? She would actually say, well, not exactly. She would say, I think the Australopithecines could walk upright like modern humans. And so from the neck down, they would have a more human-looking anatomy. So her way of thinking about Australopithecus is not like creationists. Keep that in mind. When they think of Australopithecines, they think of bipedal hominids. Bipedal means you walk upright like us. That's what they envision. Now, as a creationist, I believe we can distinguish between apes and humans, both today and in the fossil record. And I believe what you'll see is a pattern of coexistence of two distinct types, just like Leslie said, at least at face value. I really think that's what we see. Now, there are a number of different criteria for distinguishing human bones from ape bones. And these can be fairly nuanced, and this is not exhaustive. There's a lot more than just this. But I have some of these crossed out because some of these features I don't think are actually diagnostic. And we'll get to some examples of why cranial capacity, for example, can even overlap in humans and apes. So that's not a good criteria. Curved fingers as well. A lot of creationists have said that if you have curved fingers, you're probably an ape. Well, humans can actually have curved fingers as well, including this human from the Philippine Islands. And it's clearly a human. There's no great apes there, and it's associated with human remains. So instead of going through these systematically and boring you guys to death, I want to just focus on the photographs of some of the most visually obvious examples of morphological features that you can say, okay, this is an ape. Anytime you see it, it's ape. Anytime you see this, it's human. One of those is the human hand. And this is from an evolutionist saying, the hand is one of the most distinctive traits of humankind. I agree. The human hand can be distinguished from that of apes by its long thumb relative to fingers. Notice in primates, like a chimpanzee, for example, you have a very short thumb relative to long fingers. They have a hard time reaching their fingertip. Humans, on the other hand, we have a long thumb relative to short fingers. And that allows us to touch the tips of our fingers like this. This is helpful for manipulating tools, evolutionists will say, and things like that are clearly, and so that's very visually distinctive. When you see this in the fossil record, you know it's a human in every case. It's not ambiguous. Same thing with the ape foot. Primates have a grasping large toe. You've all seen that, right? And that's on their feet, and so it's really helpful if they want to grab something. Humans, we can't do that. Unfortunately, I wish I could. I'm going to have 3 kids in a month. I'll have a third, and I wish I had four hands to grab. But humans, on the other hand, we have a large toe that's in line with our other 4. Okay, that feature, when found as fossils, again, is just as obvious as the human hand. You can tell what it is. Another feature that maybe you don't know about, humans have a stiff or rigid midfoot. We can't bend our foot back far right here, for example, but apes can. Further back, right there, they actually have what's called a mid-tarsal break, a flexible midfoot, which is helpful if you're going to come up to a tree and you want to wrap your arms around it and put your foot against it. You can just walk right up it. They have long arms, shorter legs, and their foot can bend. Humans, we don't have that. And there's actually some bones, like metatarsals, you can actually find a single bone in a human foot, and you can tell if it's either human or ape, because you can tell if it has that flexible midfoot or not. So the human foot is, again, very distinct from apes. There's several different features in the foot where you can say it's ape or it's human, not ambiguous at all. The human spine, same thing. It's another distinctive feature to distinguish between apes and humans. Humans have an S-shaped spine with a lower lumbar curve, right, for our upright posture. Apes, on the other hand, they have a C-shaped spine. That's helpful if you're like a if you're a quadrupedal ape, you are knuckle walking. That C-shaped spine helps to hold your body weight up against gravity. So humans and apes, again, have a distinctive morphology in this respect as well. Now this one's a little more technical, but you'll notice chimps and humans, for example, if we compare them, humans actually have wider hips, and we have our large leg bone is angled more inward. And that's called a bicondylar angle. And apes, like chimps, their bicondylar angle is closer to 0. It's straight up and down, if you'll notice. And so when they walk, it's kind of like a side-to-side waddle, very different than humans. And we'll talk about that more when we look at some fossils. So here's another feature, though. The knobs on the end of the femur, so it's called the distal femur, those two knobs of the knee joint, if you look at a lateral view of those in humans, for instance, the base of that is flattened. Why do you think that's important for humans to have flattened? Well, it increases surface area or contact in the knee joint so that you can have load dissipation for standing upright and bearing the load in an upright position. Now, apes, though, they have a rounded condyle in lateral view, and it's not as elongated, it's rounded. And that's partly why they can't have a stiff or locked knee position like us where we can rest. They have like a flexed knee position, and it takes their more muscle effort to kind of maintain that position. So when you find those features, not just maybe one of them, but in combination, you can say every case, that is human or that is ape. Pretty neat, huh? And the last one I'll show you is the human and versus ape pelvis. Now, the human pelvis is very distinct visually, isn't it? You don't have to be a trained anatomist to tell the difference. Humans have a short, broad, bowl-shaped pelvis to hold the organs because we're upright, and the sacrum is wider. It's almost like a heart-shaped. And inside view, you can see it has a wider shape as well. But chimpanzees, for example, and all the primates, their sacrum, which is the part that holds the two hip bones, they're called the nominates, the two nominates together, is elongated. It's narrow. And the ilium, or the blades right here, they're more flat. And they're not bowl-shaped, right? And that makes sense because they lean over like this. They have muscle attachments from their back onto the back of the ilium, the ilia. So you can just see very visually how different human hips are from apes, and all primates really. Now, keep those distinctive features, those are just some of them. Keep those in mind. We're going to go through some of these fossil discoveries in East Africa, and I want you guys to kind of think about if those features look distinctly human or distinctly ape. And what happens if we find some of those features that are distinctly human but date older than the genus Homo? We're going to find several examples of that. So in the 1970s, as I mentioned in the beginning, Donald Johanson found a number of fossils. He found a knee joint in 1973, his first field season. He found a knee joint, he found some jaw bones and cranial material, and then in 1974, he found his famous Lucy skeleton. In 1975, they discovered the first family site pictured on the left here. In this hillside here, they found 216 bones. They excavated them in 1975 and 1976. And some were just on the surface, eroded out of the sediments, and others were found in situ, like in place, and they had to dig them out. All 216 bones are shown here, and you can see a pair of hands, mostly scattered bones. They're isolated bones. And then also Mary Leakey, remember she was working in Laetoli at the same time, she found some jaw bones as well, and that will become important in a little bit. So just keep in mind, all of these bones were found in the 70s by Donald Johanson, Mary Leakey. What did Johanson describe when he found these bones? Now today we know that he called all those bones Australopithecus afarensis. That's Lucy's kind. So remember this. When I say Lucy, I'm referring to an individual skeleton, okay? Which is right here. That's Lucy. It's a nickname given to that skeleton. But Johanson also called all these other bones as part of, not her skeleton, but her species, the species she represents. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind. But originally, it's not what he said. Originally, in the journal Nature, him and Maurice Taïeb, a French anatomist and a French paleoanthropologist, they report this. The collection suggests that Homo, humans, and Australopithecus coexisted as early as 3 million years ago. And he's describing here his 1973 to 1974 discoveries shown right here, Lucy and these right here. Notice he said he found Homo. Isn't that interesting? That claim is no longer believed today, but that's what he originally reported. Later that year, in National Geographic, he described more of his fossils, including those found from the first family site on that hillside I showed you. And what did he say about all those bones? Well, he had a theory that other experts had. And he said, and the idea was Johansen originally attributed the first family collection of 216 bones to Homo. He said it was almost like a primitive family because there were 13 individuals. You can tell from what skeletal elements and how many duplicates there were. There were 13 individuals, and he said they were all struck down at once in a flash flood. He described hand bones, like the ones I showed you on that table. Hand bones bear an uncanny resemblance to our own in size, shape, and function. The backs of the metacarpal heads have no ridges, so these individuals did not walk on their knuckles as African apes do. The thumb rotates, making it possible to manipulate the tools with finesse. Interesting. He also found foot bones from this family site. The family site is AL333. AL just means a far locality. That's how they define where they're found. He says a fifth metatarsal corresponds closely to that of what? Modern man. Jaws and teeth. He says in size and shape, the jaw could fit a Homo skull, a human skull, discovered in Kenya by Richard Leakey. Members of the research expedition made clay casts of their own teeth. One woman's jaw bore a startling resemblance to a 3 million year old specimen. What is he describing? He's describing human bones that are surprisingly old, and he's puzzling over it, but he attributed them originally to Homo. In both Nature, 1976, and in this National Geographic, he's also describing them as Homo or human. Now fast forward. Describing the same hand bones that Johansen found from that family site, experts to this day are still describing it as just like Homo sapiens. Here's a description from a scientific journal, Journal of Human Evolution. Our results indicate that A. afarensis, that's Lucy's kind, Australopithecus afarensis, possessed, her species anyway, possessed overall manual proportions, including an increased thumb-hand relationship. What's that mean? Increased thumb-hand relationship. That means long thumb relative to short fingers, a diagnostic feature. Definitely a human hand. That, contrary to previous reports, is fully human and would have permitted pad-to-pad human-like precision grip capability. We show that these human-like proportions in afarensis mainly result from hand shortening, as in modern humans, and that these conclusions are robust enough as to be non-dependent on whether the bones belong to a single individual or not. So you can see the long thumb relative to shorter fingers compared to Homo sapiens, virtually identical. This is unmistakably, clearly a human hand. But they call it Lucy's kind instead of humans. Here just a summary of all the other bones that Johansen described as human from his sites that date 3 million years and older. Human limb bones, human jaw bones, human hand bones, human foot bones. And at the same time, further south, remember the Kubifora expeditions were going on. In Kenya, he found human skull, human leg bones, human stone tools. Mary Leakey, further south in Laetoli, found human jaw bones and Laetoli prints. I'll talk about that later on. These were all human. All human. And Donald Johansen says, I was convinced there were 2 species and Hadar, where he found all these bones at the top here. He was convinced in the 1970s. And that's why he said that in National Geographic. That's why he said it in his Nature paper. He was convinced. So what happened? All those bones got reclassified as Lucy's kind, Australopithecus afarensis. How can that be? How can you on one hand say they're human, look just like ours, call them Homo, but then change your mind and say, never mind, they all belong to one species, of which Lucy is representative of. That happened, that reassessment happened in 1979 in their formal publication in Science. But it happened earlier when they were collaborating, when Johansen, this is Donald Johansen, the discoverer of Lucy, when he was collaborating with Tim White. And Tim White was a paleoanthropologist. He was an expert on jaws and teeth, just like Johansen was. And so entirely on the basis of the jaws and teeth, because at that time they hadn't studied the post-cranial remains from the neck down. They basically had to just put those aside. There was too many. They couldn't deal with it. And on the basis of the jaws and teeth alone, Tim White convinced Donald Johansen to change his mind and say, wait a second, you're not looking at multiple species like you originally thought, Homo and Australopithecus, there's just one. And they discussed this in the basement of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in 1977. And so Tim White changed his mind, and what happened is Johansen reclassified all of his human bones, all the bones he had found during his earlier field seasons from 1973 to 1976, and he called all those bones Australopithecus afarensis, and he basically put Lucy on the throne as the root ancestor of all later Homo species, including Homo sapiens. That made his discoveries even more impactful, even more significant, and him even more famous. Now, this is fascinating. I actually emailed Richard Leakey, who I emailed him before he passed away. And what this email correspondence shows is that Richard Leakey has never agreed with Johansen's reassessment. He always had maintained that there were multiple species in that collection. And he acknowledges that the reason why Johansen changed his mind is because of Tim White. At that time, Tim White believed in something known as the single species hypothesis, which nobody believes today. What that theory teaches is that you can only have one hominid species in a given geographic range because of competition for limited resources. So when Johansen was saying there's multiple species, Tim White was saying, wait, that doesn't fit with the single species hypothesis. You can't have more than one species in a given geographic area. And Richard Leakey affirms that and says, yes, he read a few chapters of my book. He complimented me. He said, anyways, good chapters, well done. He was grateful to read it, and he liked me until he found out I was a creationist. But he admitted, my other comments note that Tim White was the real reason Don changed his mind. In my view, Tim White was a product of Wolpoff's influence. Long story short, Wolpoff believed in the single species hypothesis. He believed in a model called multi-regional continuity evolution. No one believes that. They believe the out-of-Africa model. Doesn't matter. Just understand that he had long been a staunch believer in the so-called single species story. Today, he must have changed because no one believes that anymore. It's nonsense. But that is where Don switched in his thinking. Anyways, good chapters. Okay, and he laments. He says, most of this history is forgotten. But Richard Leakey remembers. And he still maintained, to the point of near his death, that no, there's multiple species. Johansen's original assessment was more accurate. Nevertheless, Johansen basically said, forget about all these human bones, jaw bones, hand bones, foot bones. He reassigned them all to Lucy's kind. And the human skulls, the human leg bones, the human stone tools, the human jaw bones that Richard Leakey found, Johansen maintained the Homo designation. He couldn't deny that. That was not up to him. However, it was a problem for Lucy being on the throne as the root ancestor because they dated too close. They dated to about 2.9 million years old. And Lucy was around closer to 3 million, 3.2 for some of these at the family site. And you can't have Lucy as the ancestor if Homo was already there. And so he dated, what did he do? They redated all of those findings to have a younger age. Amazingly. That allowed Johansen to propose Lucy as the root ancestor. And so before Donald Johansen and Tim White had collaborated and changed their views, all the dates for this very famous tuff called the KBS tuff dated to around 2.6, 2.5 million years old. And the bones that Richard found were under that, so it was even older, around 2.9 million. Long story short, notice this. All the different dating methods were made to agree, initially with Richard Leakey's model. And they pretty much boasted about that in the journal Nature. The compatibility of independent evidence, multiple dating methods all agreeing, they say, is very strong argument for accepting the chronology now proposed for Lake Turkana. But then they said, wait a second, we can't have these bones that old. All the same dating methods we're now made to agree with a younger age. Incredible. Yet we're told the dating methods are independent, they're totally detached from bias and from theories. Not so. Amazing. All the dates changed to agree with a new model that Johansen promoted. Think about this though. If Johansen is trying to lump human bones and Australopithecus bones of different species, even different genera, into one species, how did he explain why some bones look very different from others? How did he explain the range of variation? It's not easy to get away with that when you're doing this in front of anatomists. They can see there are bones that don't seem to fit a single species. Well, his story was this. It's sexual dimorphism. Do you guys know what sexual dimorphism is? It's differences between male and female of the same of the same species. Male, for example, orangutan. Males are like 3 times bigger than females. So he says, well, there you go. The broad range of variations explained by sexual dimorphism. The problem is the type of sexual dimorphism that Johansen and White were now proposing had to do with not just size, but locomotor behavior. Some bones look like they're made for walking upright just like humans. Others look like they're made for swinging in trees. And people had problems with that. Some people agreed with it, but they still admitted that that's still hard to believe. So here's me paraphrasing from the scientific journal, a very technical, I'm simplifying because it was written very technically. And what Stern and Sussman explain, they agree with Johansen though. They say the larger human-looking bones belong to males that walked habitually upright like modern humans, whereas the smaller ape-looking bones belong to females that lived in the trees. Are you kidding me? Even though they are supporting that model that they're advocating for, they admit the degree of sexual difference in locomotor behavior and afarensis was greater than any living ape. So they're saying, look, I'm promoting this view, but it is a little bit of a stretch. We've never seen this before in the animal kingdom. Now, it's not surprising then, other experts in the field disagreed strongly. They said, I'm not buying it. That's ridiculous. And here is a well-known paleoanthropologist, Adrian. She says, the interpretation of extreme sexual dimorphism for these fossils has been a mere assertion from the beginning. Features which show 2 different patterns cannot easily be accommodated within one species. The upper limb material shows that in addition to size variation between as well as within localities, 2 morphological patterns exist. In other words, 2 distinctly different anatomies exist. Similarly, the lower limb, there are 2 morphological patterns in the distal femur. And she goes on with more technical language and says, that evidence, including things like limb bone size and morphology, strongly questions the existence of a single species at Hadar, as well as its validity as a new species. Amazing, right? Now, it's not just in the 70s when Johansen found all these human bones and then reclassified them as Lucy's kind. After that time, until recent times, they continue to find more and more human bones that, for the sake of argument, if we accept their dates, date older than genus Homo. And they're still refusing to call them Homo sapiens. They're still assigning them to Lucy's kind to bolster the narrative that they walked upright like us and looked like us from the neck down. And I want to go through a few of these examples, including human footprints, more human foot bones, a partial human skeleton. And so I'll focus first on a foot bone. Now, this is a 4th metatarsal bone of the foot. So not the toes, but behind that. And what's really interesting is this foot bone was found at site AL333. Remember where that is? That's the family site that I showed you, that hillside. That's the same site where Johansen originally found human foot bones. Now they found more. This is in 2011. And here it is right there, compared to Homo sapiens. This is one of those key bones of the foot that you can tell if it had a rigid midfoot or a flexible mid-tarsal break like apes. Compared to chimpanzees and gorillas, very different morphology. Very distinctive, unmistakable human anatomy in this. Even the research can't help but acknowledge that the deep flat base and tarsal facets imply that its midfoot had no ape-like mid-tarsal break. These features show that afarensis' foot was functional like that of what? Modern humans. And support the hypothesis this species was a committed terrestrial biped, meaning walked habitually upright just like us. This is another example of a human bone, unmistakable human anatomy that should have been attributed to Homo sapiens, but because of their evolutionary mindset and their worldview, they just attribute it to Lucy's kind. Otherwise, it would falsify the Ape-to-Man story. You can't find human foot bones with a rigid midfoot before the genus Homo unless you make up a story that they had feet like ours and walked upright like us before they evolved big brains. This making sense to everyone? This is how evolutionists think. This is how paleoanthropologists think. This is why it can be so misleading. That bone, combined with several others that Johansen found from the family site earlier in the 70s, can now be put together into a composite foot. And it's unmistakably human, the anatomy of the foot. From the Journal of Human Evolution. These are not even creationist quotes. Together with other material from AL333, the family site at Hadar, this specimen strengthens the conclusion that afarensis possessed a more human-like foot with an adducted hallux. What does that mean? It means the big toe is in line with the other four. This foot does not have an ape-like appendage like this, okay? So it's a more human-like foot with an adducted hallux and dorsoplantarly tall metatarsal base is adapted to resist tarso-metatarsal dorsiflexion. That just means the foot is rigid. It does not have a flexible midfoot that can bend like apes, and it contributes to the converting the foot into a lever during push-off phase of terrestrial bipedal locomotion. All that technical jargon just means this looks just like modern human feet. Amazing. This finding alone falsifies the Ape-to-Man story as popularly taught since the 70s to the present. Here's another discovery. This is a partial skeleton that was discovered and reported in 2010. The name is Katanumu. That's in the local Afar language. If you translate that into English, it would be big man. So this big man skeleton dated to 3.6 million years old, according to their dating methods. And they compared it to Turkana-boy. Turkana-boy is the best preserved Homo erectus specimen that we have. Homo erectus, according to creationists, and I would agree, is Homo sapien. It's one of us. And they're noting, wow, look how similar the skeleton of big man is to Turkana-boy. And they're puzzled by that, but it fits with their narrative, though, that we evolved bipedal anatomies before big brains. So they say, in their own words, Katanumu's skeletal features are surprisingly similar to those of modern humans. Why is it surprising? It's not surprising to creationists. The pelvis is essentially of modern human aspect and differs little from that of modern humans. I would agree. And this expert says big man, and by extension afarensis, the species, and Turkana-boy weren't really different from the neck down. It's so obvious, it's right in front of their eyes. If it looks human, it is human. But from an evolutionary point of view, they're happy to call those Australopithecus if they predate the origin of the genus Homo. And at 3.6, that definitely predates the origin of the genus Homo. So they will never call that Homo unless they, again, admit a biblical model of coexistence, which I don't think they're going to do anytime soon. Now, some might say, well, Chris, what about the skull? Well, that's the problem. This partial skeleton here does not preserve a skull. And the most complete reconstructed skulls they have of afarensis' kind were found at a totally different site, at a totally different stratigraphic level, without any physical association to the lower anatomy. And so there's no way you can possibly determine if this ape-like skull belonged on this human-like body as a species. But yet, that's what they believe. That's what they're claiming. So I'm not saying that they believe this skull literally fit on this skeleton, but they're saying this type of distinctly ape-looking skull they attribute to the species that would have had a human-looking skeleton from the neck down. But I would say these are distinctly ape-looking skulls. Certain features indicate they had a spine insertion angle that corresponds more to chimps, for example, and not like humans. I would say these are ape skulls, no question about it, and they should never be considered associated with those human postcranial anatomies. So these skulls do not belong to the big man skeleton, nor Lucy, nor any human postcranial bones. That postcranial just means neck down. Now I'm going to talk about something a little controversial, a little unorthodox from creation perspective, so don't throw stones at me, okay? I have a different theory about Lucy than anyone has ever proposed as a creationist. I have known this for several years, and I just admitted it finally a few days ago at another Midwest Creation Fellowship, and I was reluctant to do that because I don't want to ostracize myself from an already very small creation community. But I have to follow my conviction, and I have to follow what I believe is the truth, because the truth, I believe, will set people free. And it's also a very strong creation apologetic. So with that, let me just build my case. If you look at Lucy's femur, right here, it has a high bicondylar angle. Nobody doubts that, whether you're a creationist or evolutionist. And it's very different from, say, a chimpanzee or apes, with a very straight or vertical-looking bicondylar angle. Now, if that feature was all that you could see as being human-like, to me, I wouldn't be satisfied. But we can find, because some apes, some primates do have a higher bicondylar angle, but still, it's one standard deviation away from humans. So there is a way to distinguish it. But my point is that I wouldn't focus on just one feature alone if it was just bicondylar angle. But it's the bicondylar angle in combination with Lucy's hip that makes me come to a very different conclusion than creationists. So creationists for years have been saying that Lucy's hip looks just like a chimpanzee. What do you guys think? Here's a chimpanzee hip. Very elongated, narrow sacrum. Homo sapiens, very different kind of sacrum. We'll look at that in a moment. But also the pelvis of Native Americans, for example, short, broad, and bowl-shaped. Neanderthals, which all creationists would agree is Homo sapiens, same thing with Homo erectus, would say it's Homo sapiens. Very distinctive, human-shaped pelvises. Lucy unmistakably looks most like humans and very different than chimpanzee. Would we all agree? Absolutely. For years, I baffled over this. How can creationists claim Lucy's hip looks more like a chimpanzee? What are they looking at? And I've recognized over the years of studying this, there's a very strong groupthink in creationist circles, such that they just follow what other people told them without thinking about the evidence. And so I want to just change that and say, let's be more open-minded to the possibility that Lucy's hip looks human because she was a human. And you might say, well, Chris, what about the reconstruction? How can you trust Lucy's hip reconstruction? And I've watched videos like this from years ago from awesome creation scientists that I respect. And they would show this clip. We can't show it today because my video wouldn't work. But in this video, it's anatomist Owen Lovejoy, an evolutionist. And it's being narrated by Donald Johanson, the discoverer of Lucy. Owen Lovejoy reconstructed the hip. And in this video, there's a certain part of Lucy's fossil that is bent. I don't know if you can see it from here. I'll show you after. I'll hand it out. This is called the sacroiliac joint, and it actually fits with the sacrum. Now this part is clearly bent. Owen Lovejoy corrected that part. He got a buzzsaw out. And creationists have shown this, and I actually admit, I used to believe this was true. And so I thought that, what's wrong with showing this clip? Well, the creationist claim has been that this part was fraudulently reconstructed to make the hip look more like a human and a lot less like a chimpanzee. I was taught that. I believed that. But then I bought the fossils myself before his reconstruction. There is no doubt about it. That part of the hip absolutely needed to be fixed. And what he fixed did not affect the overall shape of the ilium. It did not affect the sacrum, for example, was found intact. It didn't affect that at all. This was found well preserved, incredibly well preserved. So there is simply no way that there's no way he could have fabricated this to make it look more like a chimpanzee. So here's the damage to the fossil. You can see right here. It's bent. He simply corrected it by making it more anatomically reasonable. It didn't change the overall shape of it though. But here's what happened though. If you don't fix that part, this is the sit bone. The sit bone is supposed to be facing down like this, okay? But the sit bone, because of the fossil damage, makes it go like this. It rotates it upward. That's an anatomical monstrosity. You can't have a hip like that. You can't have one hip like this and the other one down on the other side, mirror image down. That's absurd. He had to fix that. Now, and if you don't fix it, there's a small gap there. But it didn't change the overall fit of the pieces of the ilium of the innominate, which is this part. There were clear joins between the pieces, and again, the sacrum was found intact. So I actually agree with the reconstruction. In fact, multiple reconstructions have been done, including independent of Lovejoy's. And these all agree with each other. The differences are very subtle. They have to do with the birth canal dimensions. The sacrum was corrected digitally to make it more symmetrical. Again, but it's still human. And this person I emailed not long ago. And they wrote me back. The person who reconstructed this one digitally said that it's very similar to Martin Hausler's, which is this one. They actually look similar to all of them, but he's being very technical as the reconstructor. He says, I did it blind of that reconstruction. He did it from its individual pieces, from scratch digitally, and ended up looking just like it. So the overall shape of the hip, regardless of the reconstruction, is short, broad, and bowl-shaped with a heart-shaped sacrum, unmistakably human. Here's another diagnostic feature that only humans have in their hip. This is called the anterior inferior iliac spine. And it's preserved well on Lucy's innominate in a part that was not damaged in any way. That bony protrusion right there is very important in humans and doesn't occur in any primates. The equivalent part in primates is flat. And the rectus femoris, a quadricep muscle, attaches to that point right there. It's an anchor point and allows us to go like this. It's the kicking muscle. So humans can walk upstairs, can walk and move our legs forward. That is a diagnostic human trait. That alone demonstrates this is a human hip bone. Now evolutionists, though, they have no problem with that because that fits again with their narrative that Lucy's kind could walk upright like us. And so they're happy to entertain that idea that, yes, this is a human feature, but we believe they were evolving into us. So that's how they interpret it. But look at this. Here's the chimp pelvis, very long, narrow sacrum. Another example, very long and narrow of chimp. Here's humans, very distinct. What does Lucy's most closely resemble? Human or chimp? Human. Absolutely. And if you actually scale it larger and correct the distortion, it fits right in with Homo sapiens. I'm trying to argue that Lucy could walk upright like us and had distinctive human anatomies because Lucy was a human. When I had that epiphany, and by the way, I deleted something right here. This arrow is pointing to Lucy's sacrum. This arrow is pointing to the half hip bone, not of Lucy, but of a pygmy human. When I was praying about this several years ago, I was saying, Lord, why do creationists believe this is a chimp-like hip? I don't get it. It looks human to me. And I was wrestling with that. And as I was praying literally on the screen, Google Images, I was staring at something. I was puzzled. I was like, why is it? That picture doesn't look right. I recognize Lucy's sacrum, but that's definitely not Lucy's half hip bone. And I realized that was the hobbit's. What's the hobbit? The hobbit is a small-bodied human that was found on the Indonesian island of Flores. And evolutionists call it a new species of human, Homo floresiensis. Creationists, on the other hand, would say it's human, but it's a small-bodied human called a pygmy. And actually, even the lead member of the discovery team made the same conclusion. He said it's actually a Homo sapien. It's a human. It's a diseased modern human. And he actually went to a pygmy population that still lives in Flores, in the Indonesian island. They still live there. And so even evolutionists would argue that hip belongs to a small-bodied human, a pygmy human with very short stature. And it clicked for me. And so here's the reaction of evolutionists when they fit together the sacrum of Lucy, which is an adult as well. You can tell from the bones it's an adult. Dr. William Jungers from Stony Brook, he's a paleoanthropologist. He tries fitting a hobbit hip bone, the ilium right here, to a cast of Lucy's tailbone, the sacrum, they mean. To his surprise, they were a perfect fit. Lucy, the 3.2 million-year-old specimen, actually it's not the type specimen, ignore that though, it's LH4. For Australopithecus afarensis from Ethiopia was an early biped that stood just over a meter tall. The close match with a 17,000-year-old fossil in Indonesia, this one is astounding. Well, it's not astounding if both of them are small-bodied adult humans, both being pygmies. And guess what? There is still pygmies that live in Central Africa today, in the region of the Congo. So pygmies live today in both Central Africa and on the Indonesian island of Flores. No wonder they fit together. They're both humans. They're just small-bodied humans. So what I'm suggesting is that in East Africa, sometime after the flood, because we can tell based on where they're found in the sedimentary record, these are post-flood, sometime after the flood, probably after the Babel dispersion, there was a pygmy population that lived in East Africa. Makes sense, right? Well, there's more evidence that supports that idea. I'm calling this the pygmy human hypothesis. This is a knee joint that was found at a separate site in Hadar, found by Donald Johanson a year before he found Lucy. And this knee joint looks unmistakably human. Even though Johanson couldn't help but notice, he said man-like knees are made for man-like walking. And this knee joint has all the anatomical features that are characteristic of human knee joints. And that includes, and I'll briefly mention this, if you look at, for example, modern humans, if you were to imagine turning the upper femur here, right, the distal end of the femur, right there. My battery's dying. Imagine turning the knee joint like this, so you can look at the underside of it. If you look at those condyles, you'll be able to see that there's a raised patellar lip. See that? And also a deep patellar groove. That is a distinctive human trait that prevents us from dislocating our knee because of the bicondylar angle. It kind of keeps it in place. And humans also have the high bicondylar angle and the elongated and flattened condyles at the base. See that? AL129, attributed to Lucy's kind, has those same features. Unmistakably human and very different from apes, which have a flat patellar surface. They don't have this deep groove or a raised lateral lip, and has a low bicondylar angle and rounded condyles. So this knee joint is more evidence that there was a small-bodied population that lived in East Africa. Because guess what? This knee joint is an adult, but it's very small. So we have another individual that lived near Lucy, and that's amazing. So a pygmy population once lived in Hadar, Ethiopia? I would say so. Amazing. Yet there's also larger distal femur bones, for example, that have those characteristic features of humans that were found at the family site that Johanson originally called Homo, and that's larger. So we see ordinary-sized humans living alongside smaller-bodied humans, pretty much like today. Fairly ordinary. Let me just show you all these. We're almost done. Let me just show you all these similarities between LB1, that's the fossil numbering system for Hobbit. So Hobbit's the pygmy human from Flores, compared to Lucy on the right. Here's some of the very interesting similarities. First of all, pygmies still live in both places, generally. Nearly identical height. They're estimated to be approximately 3 feet 6 inches tall for both of them. Nearly identical body proportions. The proportions are actually based on something called the humerofemoral index. That's measuring the length of the humerus of the arm relative to the large leg bone, the femur. And those, it's called a humerofemoral index. They're almost identical. Nearly identical cranial capacity. Both had small skulls, small brains. They're small people, so that's part of it, but also just smaller than normal. Flat-footed. Nevertheless, the overall foot anatomy is human. Lucy preserves 2 toe bones, which are not diagnostic, but it does preserve a talus, and the talus looks morphologically human. The talus is where the tibia and fibula articulate to. So that looks very human. And you can tell, though, from the fingers and toes, they're curved. But guess what? Even athletes can have curved fingers, for example. So that's not a diagnostic trait. So creationists should not get too worked up about curved fingers or curved toes. The overall anatomy of the foot is still human. Broad pelvises with laterally flaring ilia. So what I mean by laterally flaring is in both Hobbit and humans, and also in Native American pelvises, I just showed you some pictures, the ilia can actually flare out a little bit more, but those are in common. Interesting. So these are distinctive features in common to pygmy types. Okay. And finally, our last example, Mary Leakey. Remember, she was working in Laetoli, Tanzania, and in the 1970s, she found a trackway fossilized in ash. They were 3 individuals. They had a human-like, very human-looking footprints. In fact, one footprint trackway has a smaller individual walking exactly in the footprints of the other. Like human behavior. Imagine walking through the sand and you're stepping in or in the snow, you're stepping in your father's footprints, for example. And then later in 2015, at a stratigraphically equivalent site, they found more footprints of a larger individual. And Mary Leakey from the beginning said these look remarkably similar to those of modern man. These date 3.7 million years old, long before humans are supposed to have been around. And the bigger footprints, they're attributing it to Lucy's kind as well. And they say maybe it was something like a Chewy, they're joking, like Chewbacca, like some large Australopithecus. So they're looking for some type of Bigfoot creature with an ape skull, very human-looking body, and human feet. But the biblical explanation is much more parsimonious. It makes much more sense. Those footprints look human because they were made by humans, and the dating methods are flawed. So if you zoom in at those footprints, this is from site G, the original site found by Mary. That footprint looks unmistakably human. Here's anatomist, evolutionary paleoanthropologist Owen Lovejoy describing it and comparing it to humans and apes. He says, when we compare the Laetoli prints to that of a chimpanzee, the difference is immediately obvious. I would agree. The chimpanzee, which is a quadruped, still has a free great toe, and that great toe extends out away from the foot and leaves a very distinct mark. On the other hand, when we compare the Laetoli print to that of a crime scene human print, they're virtually, what? Indistinguishable. The great toe is in line with the rest of the toes, and what this has done in the human and the Laetoli print is to create an arch, and that's a hallmark of typical modern upright locomotion. This finding alone falsifies the ape-to-man story. Now, what do we do with the dates, though? I could talk in more detail on this, but what happened is evolutionists have a method of dating called potassium-argon dating. And in general, how it works is they have a parent isotope called potassium. And potassium decays with a long half-life of 1.5 billion years into its daughter product, argon. And what they believe is that, what they claim, the underlying assumption is that when you have an eruption, for example, and lava extrudes, and as it's still molten lava, they believe that any of the argon, the daughter product, it's a noble gas, and it's a slippery molecule in that sense, and it escapes from the lava before it crystallizes. So that any of the argon that's found in it after it crystallizes, when they go to date it, they assume is from the in situ radioactive decay of the parent isotopes. The problem with that is this. Excess argon that does not come from decay of the parents can become trapped in it because it doesn't fully escape. It can come from the atmosphere, and they have correction factors for that, but it can also come from the mantle. From nerdy things called xenoliths or xenocrysts, minerals like rocks like peridotite that have olivine, and olivine is a mineral that can actually trap in its lattice structure argon. So there's much more argon in the mantle than there is in the atmosphere, and they can't adequately account for that, and they're not. And so basically what that's doing is it's locking in excess argon, giving the appearance of great age, because they're assuming that argon came from the parent isotope when really it came from the mantle, it didn't escape, and it's giving the appearance of age. Does that make sense? It's a technical kind of description, but there's one way you can test that assumption. There's one way that I know you can test that. You can test for excess argon by dating rocks of known age. So here's Mountain Rohu. This is in New Zealand, and there are a series of lava flows. We know when they happened. We have photographic evidence. 1975, lava flows happened. They formed rock. Yet those rocks, when they potassium argon date them, even though we know when they formed just recently in history, they give dates of millions of years. Interestingly, close to the range of, say, these hominids, like Lucy. There's many other examples in the scientific literature of recent eruptions giving dates of millions of years for rocks that formed very recently in history. That is confirming the presence of excess argon that is not fully escaping from the lava when it crystallizes, giving the appearance of great age. Therefore, the same thing with ash. Ash congeals very rapidly. It's locking in excess argon, and it's giving the appearance of great age. And so the Laetoli footprints, we can say, are not 3.7 million years old, nor any of those tuffs that they're dating, these ash tuffs they're dating for these human bones I mentioned that Richard Leakey found, the KBS tuff. They use potassium argon. And some would say, yeah, but Chris, now they use argon-argon, an improved method. So now we can account for excess argon because of this improved method. Long story short, the argon-argon method still must be calibrated with a monitor or a standard of known age, which itself is most often dated using the flawed potassium-argon method. It's not an independent method, so it still has the same problems of the other method. Okay, I give a longer talk on that. Sorry if it was a little technical, but the bottom line is that even if you accept for the sake of argument their dates, what it does is that you find all these anatomically human bones that predate the origin of genus Homo, completely falsifies their model, and when you address the dating methods, it collapses the timeline and looks very biblical anyway. This is from my book that I wrote, co-authored with Dr. John Sanford. And in the book, we have just documenting these examples. And today I shared some new ones, including Lucy, with you. So again, coming back to the main point, how many fossils, out-of-place fossils, does it take to falsify the Ape-to-Man story? Just one. I've showed you several examples, and there's many more. There's no more that I will be documenting. They're everywhere. What is the biblical model? It's much simpler. According to the Bible, God created Adam and Eve on day 6 of the creation week, and he created them recently. On the same day of creation, God also made land creatures. That would include the great apes. Now, I don't know how many great ape kinds God originally created, but perhaps those very ape-looking skulls belong to some type of Australopithecine-like ancestor that God created that was very ape-like. Once you remove all those human bones, what you're left with are those very apish-looking features, those very apish-looking skulls and other bones that are clearly made for arboreal locomotion or arboreal movement. And so in a biblical scenario, you can have variations within each kind. That's not evolution. You have built-in genetic diversity, can produce beautiful diversity within those kinds, but the Australopithecus kind did not give rise to Homo. We've always coexisted because they were created on the same day of creation, and after the flood, they continued to coexist, although some types went extinct, like the Australopithecines, and they're found today as fossils. And all these so-called Homo types that they give species names for, like Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus, those are actually Homo sapiens. They're all variants of humans, and actually some of them show signs of inbreeding. We've sequenced the genome of Neanderthals, and it turns out they're acknowledging in their own journals, it looks like they did close sibling intermarriage, and they had a high genetic load. That means they had a large accumulation of mutations. So some of these anomalous features could be explained simply through inbreeding and things like founder effects if you're into genetics. Long story short, they always ask, why is there only one last standing ape? Or why are we the lone survivors? It's a very biblical view, isn't it? Just one human, Homo sapiens, just one species. Well, the biblical explanation makes perfect sense because God created one blood, didn't he? We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We're all Homo sapiens. We're all members of the same human family. Okay, so that's the biblical model. Conclusions, testable scientific hypotheses must be falsifiable. Is it impossible to be born before your ancestors? The discovery of numerous anatomically human bones and artifacts dating prior to the origin of the genus Homo falsifies the evolutionary ape-to-man model. Lucy's kind, Australopithecus afarensis, includes numerous misclassified bones that belong to humans. Once correctly classified, there is no basis to claim afarensis walked like us and add a human-looking skeleton from the neck down. In other words, the missing link claims all crumble. The reason why those bones and footprints found in East Africa look so remarkably human, from their own words, is simply because they are. These findings support the biblical model of coexistence, rather than extinct apes, Australopithecus, giving rise to Homo. The biblical view of history recorded in Genesis is consistent with the hominid fossil record, and the radioisotope dating methods used to date the hominid fossil sites are not reliable. Why does this matter? This matters because when I was in high school, I doubted the Bible, I doubted God's existence, and I said, well, if I was born in a Muslim home or born in an atheist home, that's what I would be, right? And I thought, if I'm just an evolved ape, I'm certainly not going to walk the straight and narrow and look like a weirdo in school and not do what my friends are doing. That's a difficult age. So when I was in high school, I had to know, am I an evolved ape? I don't care if I am, I just want to know what the truth is. I don't want to follow what feels good or sounds good, what is objectively true. And thank God that the Lord got a hold of me, and I did a lot of research, and I've been doing it ever since high school. I gave my first talk in 2005, but what I realized is that we absolutely have a soul. We are not evolved apes. You were created on purpose and for a purpose. We're not animals. God decides right and wrong. We're accountable to God. We're going to stand before Him one day when we die. And so I want to encourage you, I think we're all believers here, but I want to encourage you all to remember, just be wary. There are so many people who are forfeiting their souls all over YouTube. They're putting their trust in a few broken, scattered bones. They're throwing away their soul, trusting in man's fallible ideas about the past who weren't there, and all the while, these bones actually fulfill the biblical view, don't they? This is an amazing quote. Paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, a well-known evolutionist, he says, even allowing for the poor record we have of our close extinct kin, Homo sapiens appears distinctive and unprecedented. There is certainly no evidence, he says, no evidence to support the notion that we gradually became who we inherently are over an extended period of time, in either the physical or intellectual sense. And I want to remind you of Mark, what Jesus said in Mark, about how precious our soul is. He says, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. There is a cost to following Christ, right? For what does it benefit a person to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? But the cost is far greater than losing your soul, isn't it? Okay, let me close in prayer. Real quick, I do have other resources. These are on Amazon. And the DVD in the center, no one uses DVDs anymore, so I put that on YouTube. You can get it for free. But Contested Bones has to do with the hominid fossils. Genetic Entropy was written by my co-author. He wrote a book basically explaining why we're not evolving but devolving due to the accumulation of harmful mutations that are not being eliminated from the population from negative selection. And so we're getting more mutant every generation, which is a really powerful argument against evolution. And so if you want to watch the film I just showed you, you can scan this QR code. It would really help me out if you guys subscribe to my YouTube channel. I just started. I have very few subscribers. I'd love to have some help there. I'm going to be also posting videos like this one on there probably if it came out okay. If I didn't totally embarrass myself, I'll post that on YouTube. And then I am totally donation-based ministry. So without you guys, I really can't do this. So if you want to go to my website, go to backgenesis.org. You can sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to stay in touch with you guys. And with that, we'll just close in prayer, and I'll pass it off, and we could do Q&A time if you want. Okay. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this group and just their sincerity to just want to learn this information or be gracious and pretend like they're listening to my boring explanations. But Lord, we just love you so much, and we pray, Father, that we know that this lie has taken so many people captive. There's so many people, Lord, who are being led to hell because they're convinced that we evolved from apes. Lord, I pray that this generation would repent and say, Lord, forgive me. There is a loving, good God who created me. And He is a God we can have a personal relationship with through Jesus Christ because He spilt His blood on the cross. He died on the cross for our sins, taking our place on the cross so that we could be forgiven. The forgiveness of sins is the greatest news ever told. That is the gospel. Lord, we pray this message would go far and wide to show people that they were created by a loving, good God and that we can be redeemed. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.